In this transient tutorial, we're going to take a look at the menu system here. And here we see instrument. This is where we select one of the preset or user instruments. Currently, I'm selected a user instrument. And let's take a look here at the menu option here. Just your voice 1. This is where you're going to do your sample selection for voice 1. Then you've got your mod source to modulate the sample select for voice 1. And here you've got your mod amount for voice 1. Here's voice 2. You've got 2 sample playback voices within the transient. This selects the sample to playback for the second voice. Again, you've got a modulation source we can select for voice 2 to select its sample. Here's your modulation amount for voice 2. And here's the modulation section. This is modulation 1 section. We can see our voices bypassed. Here's our gain setting for mod 1. Here's mod section 2. We can see voice 2 is being bypassed. That means there's no modulation happening there. And it's got a gain of 100. Here's modulation oscillator 1. This is where we select the waveform. Here's where we select the frequency for modulation oscillator 1. Here's the modulation source to control the frequency of oscillator 1. Here's the modulation amount. Here we determine whether the phase will restart every time a new trigger is input into the transient. And here we can see that vertical line shows us where the phase will begin within the waveform we've selected. Here we can modulate or select a modulation source to modulate our phase. And here's the phase amount. Modulation oscillator 2 is identical in all the parameters you've got there. Here's our mixer, our voltage controlled mixer. We've got voice 1 and voice 2. The number to the right of those names tells us the percentage of mix for each voice. Here we can select our modulation source to control that mix. And here we can set the modulation amount for the mix. Here's our digital effects section. Here we could select companding, distortion, or bit crushing. We can define the number of bits. And we can set the resample rate. Here's our filter. We currently are set to all pass. That means everything is bypassing the filter. We could select a low pass, band pass, or high pass as well for that filter. Here's our filter cutoff frequency. Here we can select a modulation source for the cutoff frequency. And here we can select the modulation amount for that cutoff filter frequency. Here's the dynamics section. So here we can select the modulation source to control the dynamics. Here we can set the low range of dynamics, and here the high range for dynamics. And here's where we select what instrument we'd like to save our settings to, and then we could confirm if we're actually saving a sound. And the way you navigate here, we've got this encoder. You turn it to move around. Obviously, when you are selecting a parameter, that parameter is underlined. And as soon as we get to the parameter we want to edit, go ahead and click on the encoder. And now we can make adjustments to that parameter. So you'll see samples start out at 000 and go all the way up to 432, meaning there's 433 samples in all to choose from. Samples are arranged according to the instrument that they came from. So we start out in the lower registers with all the classic drum machines and then work our way up into the more modern sounds from the Access modular. So right here we can see this came from the DR55, and you'll notice that the samples are in order as you would expect to find them, let's say from left to right or low frequency to high frequency. So we start out with our kick, our snare, rims, cowbell, clave, closed hi-hat, open hi-hat, cymbal, and then we go on to the next drum machine. So here again you can see kicks and toms and bongos and claves and snares. The sounds actually get higher in frequency typically the higher you go in the sample range. So here's our TR-606, TR-8000, and we've got the 808, 909, TR-505, TR-707, 727, the Lin LM1, and then we get into the Future Retro Universal Drum Synth, and then all of the sounds we've sampled from the XS. So let's go ahead and start. We're going to demonstrate this voice with the 909 sounds. So one nice thing about the samples for each drum machine being all together here, you can see it's very easy to manipulate within the sounds of that drum machine if you like. So right here we've sampled the 909. It's actually the little click sound that we sampled from the trigger output. The next sample would be the kick drum. There's variations here of different kick drums. And so we're going to set it right here. And you'll notice here on the modulation source for voice 1, we've assigned K1, which is knob 1, to adjust the sample select. So when it's turned all the way down here, we're going to be hearing that sound right there. And as we turn it up, we're going to be scanning through those samples, and we'll be able to select others on the fly. Now here, the modulation amount is set to 28. It can go all the way up to 100, or even go into the negative value ranges. Let's leave it at 28 because I know that's going to access all the sounds from the 909. So when we play this sample back, we've got our click here. And now it starts accessing all the different drum sounds, the kick drums, now the toms. What this does is it allows us to really quickly fine-tune whatever instrument we want from the 909. And now that we have two voices, we have a similar setup here on voice 2. We start out with the click track from the 909. We've got a modulation source. Instead of K1, we're using K2 to select that. And our modulation amount is the same as the other knob there. So we'll have the same range with each knob. Now let's go ahead and look at our mixer setting. Here our mix is all the way set to voice 1. So we're using CV1 coming from the key output of our external sequencer here. That's also providing the gate into the trigger input, and we've got the accent routing into CV2. CV2 we're not using right now, but we will use this CV, this key CV coming in here, and we can use this attenuator here to tell it how much it's going to fade from voice 1 to voice 2. Let's go ahead and try that, and obviously you don't really hear any difference because they're both playing the click track. It doesn't matter where it's fading. Let's go ahead and select a kick drum here. So it's playing the kick drum only on when we get a low modulation source, and as we get a higher modulation source, it's fading over into this one. So let's select a voice, different sample for voice 2. And let's go ahead and try to pick a different snare drum. So as we turn our modulation all the way down, it's just going to play this. As we increase it, it's going to go over here. Now if we had more control over our external CV, we could manually pan between the two voices. But that's a nice way that you can just do simple velocity crossfades between the two different voices. And it's also a nice way, let's go ahead and select some hi-hats here. Alright, so we have a closed hi-hat here and our open hi-hat over here. And you'll notice it's just mixing a balance between those two. Let's say we take our key CV out of CV1 and instead plug in our accent into CV1. Now it will abruptly jump from this sample to that sample and there won't be any mix between. Let's turn up our modulate. So now we're getting abrupt changes between the two different voices without any mix between. Now, since that's a logic signal, as we bring this down, let's say it's halfway in the mix, it's actually going to mix halfway between it'll mix the two voices equally when our voltage coming in is full strength, or 5 volts. So that's a great way that you could use this setup to create open-close type hi-hats or alternating sounds. Now let's go ahead and look at what else we could do, because basically we're just trying to create a single drum voice at this point. I'm going to pull this back out, and I'm going to plug my key CV back into CV1, and for the moment I'm going to just leave that turned all the way down, and I'm going to turn all those down. Now let's go ahead and adjust the mixer real quick so that CV1 no longer affects our mix. We can go set the mod amount to 0. And now let's look at voice 1. So here we can, and now as we increase this external CV attenuation and send it into our circuit, nothing's happening because we've got our mix set up only to listen to this. Instead, what we're going to do is play with all of our options here to modulate the sample select. So we've got CV1, which is right here. This knob's attenuating it, and it is going to control the selection of this. So instead of this knob, you'll notice this knob has no effect any longer because CV1's routed to it. But let's go ahead and increase our CV mount. And here you can hear that CV scanning through the different samples. Now, one thing I'll tell you is it's really nice to have the CV pattern you're using be referenced at 0 volts. And that's because, let's say your first step of your sequence is 0 volts. It's going to play the sample we've selected here. I don't want to hear the click, so I'm going to modify this a little bit and select an actual kick drum. So now as I turn it down, that's our bass sound. As we start increasing this voltage, we'll reach higher levels into the sample map. And here you can actually hear it accessing sounds higher than the 909. It's getting into the Lin drum there. So observe, every minute little adjustment here is rescaling that CV, accessing the voice to play at any one time. So basically, with just this knob alone, without adjusting the rhythm track at all, we're able to come up with just hundreds and hundreds of variations of the rhythm we're throwing at it and get unique tones. When you want a breakdown, you can bring this knob down real quickly and it'll play just our kick drum. So you could have a rhythm going, break it down, start introducing different elements. Alright, so that's how you can do that. Now, let's look at some of our other options. If we use CV2, since it's a logic gate coming from the accent output, let's see what happens there. So it's playing the kick drum 2 sample when the logic level is low, but on our accented steps, it's accessing a higher sample here based on the modulation amount. So basically, we could dial this in. If we set it to 0, it's now playing the kick drums. Now it's selecting a different kick drum. Now it's playing a tom. And there, with one single voice, we could actually be generating an entire closed open hi-hat thing. Let's go ahead and select a closed hi-hat. Here's our closed hi-hats. And let's set our CV back down to 0. So there, we're just playing closed hats because we have no modulation amount and it's our bass sample. As we increase this modulation amount, relying on the logic coming in here, when the signal's low, the hi-hat plays closed. When it plays high, it's playing the open hi-hat sound there. And that's another way we can generate the open-closed hi-hats with just a single voice. Now we've got another voice that we could be doing something similar to. Yeah, very interesting. A lot of stuff you can do here. Let's go ahead and we can play with different modulation amounts. Now, as we apply a negative modulation amount, we're going to be accessing samples that occur lower in the sample map memory. So we could select a hi-hat, let's say, from a different drum machine there. Now, let's see, look at some of our other modulation sources. We already know we could use knob 1 or knob 2 to kind of walk through the samples. Here's our random source. Let's go ahead and set the modulation to 0. Alright, so that's just playing our bass sample, and as we increase this, the randomization will step 1 step. If we go 2, now it's able to access a little bit farther away from our original sample. And since all of our hi-hat samples and ride samples and crash samples are all in a row, it makes a nice way to come up with some little variations for hi-hats. Or let's go ahead and turn our reference sample down here to the kicks. And now we're randomly going to select slightly different kicks to happen each time. And now we're getting into the toms. Let's go ahead and turn this down a little bit. Let's go ahead and select our toms for the range we're going to play. And we could turn the modulation amount way up. We select on a bunch of random samples. Or we could set the modulation amount very negative. Alright, you get the idea there.